So we're here with Brandon Sanderson. We're going to sit down and have a discussion. I've fielded some great questions from the internet. I've got a lot of my own. Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
I know you're a busy guy.
It's my pleasure.
Good. First thing that I'm most impressed with out of the gate is your work ethic. I follow you on Facebook and these sorts of things, and I see the time you put in. Obviously, there are writers who their fans get a little bit impatient with. We understand what that is. But I'm as a writer myself, I'm really interested to understand where you might attribute that work ethic to, because I think it really is quite amazing.
People ask me about this. I have a couple of answers. The main one is I'm really not sure. It just is what I do. But kind of armchairing it, looking at it, it has to do, I think, with the idea that I feel I would be horrible at any other job, and I haven't had so far to do another job, and I don't want to have to do another job. I feel like I've got this, I have this opportunity as a writer, full-time writer, that a lot of people would really love to have. And while I have it, and while things are working, I feel like I need to make the best of it. It's almost kind of a nod to all those who want to do it, who are saying, we wouldn't screw it up if we had the chance, so that I can say, I'm not screwing it up either. I'm taking it seriously. And I just got so many stories I want to tell that I'm very compulsive about getting them out of my head. The thing is, I say all of that. The truth is I was writing 2 books a year before I got published. That's what I did. I wrote books. I'm a storyteller. So I spent 8 years writing 2 books a year. Essentially, it was more like 7 before I sold anything.
Wow. Okay, that's good.
So I guess maybe good habits are part of it.
Yeah.
I built habits, and it's just what I do, and I don't let myself fall out of that habit because the work can pile up on me quite quickly.
Were you as assiduous a student? That guy who did homework as soon as he got home from school? That kind of
No,
thing?
I was not.
Okay.
I did just fine. I did most of my homework, but school was never an end. It was a means.
Yeah.
Writing is an end to itself for me. It is a true pleasure. It is something that I do and love and enjoy. And so there's a distinction there.
Yeah.
With school, if there were something that I just considered a hoop, and I didn't feel it would help me as much as working on my writing did, I would work on my writing instead.
Yeah. Okay, good. Talk to me a little bit about how your own writing has evolved in your view since your first published novel.
Yeah, a couple of ways. One of the things that I think I've evolved toward is early on I would pile up these climaxes at the end of my books kind of in heaps atop one another, and they would all come at once, and people called it the Brandon Avalanche. And you still can notice those. They're in some of my books. And as I've matured as a writer, I've begun to discover that isn't necessarily always the best way to do it. That if I can stagger those out, and I'm better at pacing, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think also I've grown, hopefully, better at viewpoint. One of the things I've really tried to work on is really understanding how to use the third person, third person limited, to really make a character distinctive in each sentence of their viewpoint. And I'm certainly not a master of this yet. There are people who are way better at it than I am, but it's something I'm working on. So that's, I think, something that's evolved.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is I've only been doing this for 5 years. So I haven't had a lot of time to evolve as a writer yet. I'm still kind of in the, still a little bit figuring it out.
Yeah. I noticed you talk about point of view. I think I was reading recently that you, with the new series, the Stormlight Archive, you are taking an approach where you're doing some focus on particular characters. There's certainly multiple viewpoints, but books take a certain central character.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's me trying to look at the form of the epic fantasy novel and say, what can I do to try and minimize the problems other authors have had? I have, an advantage over someone like Robert Jordan in that I've read Robert Jordan. And so hopefully I can learn from what he did. And one of the issues epic fantasy has is the more characters you add, the more depth and complexity you add, which is good. But also the more difficult it becomes to contain a story in volumes. You run into these problems where either you're cutting out half of the characters and only telling a story about half of them, which is what George Martin did in his most recent book, or you're doing what Robert Jordan did in some of his books, which is only tell a little bit from each character's story and don't progress very far. And so with this added complexity come these issues. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is to limit the number of viewpoints and add complexity in other ways, so that I can hopefully have my cake and eat it too. And one of the ways I'm doing that is by each book I'm picking one character and showing flashbacks from their history. I started the first book in media res, and then I'm catching everything up. For each character, each book will catch them up to where they began the first book in flashback, while the story is continuing with all of the other characters and with them in viewpoints. And my goal with this is each book that I can add a new character who is essentially, the past version of one of the characters, a new story that will add complexity, add depth, often be happening in a different location, but it will be expanding your understanding of one of the central characters. Yeah. So I'm adding complexity without adding more characters you have to keep track of, theoretically. Yeah. We'll see how that works.
No, it sounds like a really good approach. I may have to borrow that.
Yeah, it's really weird. If you look at this novel, one of the other things I did is I added in between, the book is divided into 5 parts, and in between each part there are several quick glimpses from around the world. I'm calling them interludes, but they're essentially just little short stories written in the world, taking place around the world, that are involved tangentially with the main plot. And so if you actually look at this book, what it is it's a novel about one character. It's a prequel about that same character, embedded and interwoven into it, and then short stories from around the world, all contained within the novel and masquerading as one big book.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So talk to us, asked about sort of your own evolution. We were talking earlier about the field, fantasy field. What are your perceptions about the way the field has changed or not, particularly with what I might call a new crop of writers?
Right.
You have Rothfuss, who's new, relatively speaking. You've got Weeks and Brett and some of these guys coming in. Do you think that with this sort of new generation, if I can use that term, things have changed or not? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I'm sure it has. I don't know if I'm an authority on this. I mean, it is something I've noticed, that it seemed like we had sort of a dry spell, and I don't think it's because there were writers that weren't writing, or even that there were writers that weren't being published. I think it was because a lot of the attention was focused other areas. Harry Potter drew a lot of attention away from epic fantasy and more toward children's fantasy. And I've mentioned some of the great authors that were writing during that period. We have Garth Nix, and we have His Dark Materials, and we have a lot of great books and a lot of great authors writing during this time in children's. And so the focus was away, and because of that, I think that I don't know. People were all focusing there, and a lot of the money was being focused there, and so a lot of the authors that came out that time may not have gotten the attention that they deserved, or whatnot. That might be part of it, or maybe a lot of the writers, like myself, were somewhat saturated with epic fantasy, particularly some of the sort of familiar old stories, so to speak. Robert Jordan did Eye of the World, and I really, really loved his series. And after reading that, everything else that tried a similar sort of story, instead of like before, when I would say, "Oh, great, I love this type of story," I would say, "You know what? This is not as good a version of The Wheel of Time."
Right.
And because of that, I, as a reader, stopped reading those. Particularly in the late 90s, whenever I would see another one, I'd look at it and it'd have generally the same story, the same plot. I'd say, well, I've already got The Wheel of Time, I don't need that. And I wonder if a lot of other readers were doing that as well. Yeah. That might be the case. And what you see in this new crop that you mentioned, a lot of us, you compare us, there's some definite things happening. One is I do see YA crossover, YA influence in some of the authors, not all of them, but in some of them. Seems like what I mean by that is some faster pacing, some starting with a bigger bang and keeping the pacing like in a YA book. One of the big hallmarks of YA is you don't have the time for extensive world building. You hit it hard with plot and character, and you go as fast as you can through the book. And as fast as you can. It changes depending on what type of book you're doing. And so I see an influence of that in some of the fantasies. I also see kind of this this evolution of the next step in fantasy. I see many fewer of the familiar plots and more of looking elsewhere for stories and plots, and combining a lot of what they call slipstream. These aren't slipstream authors, but there's just a little bit of a touch of that in these books, where genres are getting mixed and crossed a little bit. I mean, if you look at Mistborn, it's essentially, you know, and Lies of Lamora. Both of us kind of came with the same premise, which is a heist novel done in a fantasy world, which is, again, it's a little bit slipstream. It's a little bit, we're taking this genre and we're doing a fantasy version of this, and combining it with different things. And of course, he went much more heist and I went much more toward epic. But there's this natural sort of, seems like, evolution of us writers who are tired of those plots and doing other things.
Yeah. So you mentioned world building. I'm interested to know, and this is probably something that's been documented, but maybe we take it from a different tack here, which is your world building. I know that some writers extensively create, and there'll be more notes around the world before they start than the book will actually end up being. I've spoken with other writers who they kind of do it as they go. They have a general idea, and I don't know that one's right or wrong, but I'm interested in your approach.
I am what George R. R. Martin calls an architect. I build a big framework before I put a story into it. He has this, I used to call them outliners and discovery writers, but I really like Martin's wording on it. He calls them architects and gardeners.
I like that.
It's a very, very evocative way of looking at it. It's great imagery. And so I'm more of an architect. I do build things out a lot ahead of time, particularly my settings. And so I know all of this. I have, you know, I'm one of those that has hundreds of thousands of words of notes before I start the book. But you know, everyone kind of falls on this, these lines somewhere different.
Sure.
Everyone's going to mix what parts of them are architect and what parts of them are gardener. Like, for instance, I'm pretty sure that while Robert Jordan did a lot of world building and was an architect in that way, when he came to his stories and his characters, he was much more a gardener, because looking at the notes, he would be working on this scene over here and watching it grow, and then he'd put it away for a while and work on this scene over here and grow it out and see where it went, rather than building an absolute framework and then filling it in.
That's cool.